Welcome to Novelist Spotlight, the podcast where published fiction writers are interviewed to gather their insights and writing lessons so we can use them to make ourselves better and more effective writers. Now, on with our program.
My name is Ray Nayler. I am a Foreign Service Officer. Right now, I am the International Advisor at NOAA in their Marine Protected Areas Center. And before that, I was in Kosovo. Before that, I was in Azerbaijan, working backwards. Before that, I was in Kyrgyzstan. Before that, I was in Vietnam, in Ho Chi Minh City, which is where the idea for my novel, The Mountain and the Sea, which is my debut novel, was born. And before I joined the Foreign Service, I was in Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan again, Russia, and I've all in all been abroad since about 2003. Just moved back to the United States at the end of July.
And this is Mike Consul, your host, and Ray also talks Russian. We're not going to be speaking Russian during this podcast, but he's what an interesting background. And now, as he says, he's the author of his first novel. He's been writing since he was 16 years old, but he's come out with his first novel, The Mountain and the Sea. We'll talk about that story here in just a little bit. But let me start by saying, Ray Nayler, thank you for taking the time and welcome to the program.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. I really appreciate you inviting me, and it's great to be here.
It's great to have you. And so let's talk about your background a little bit. You started writing fiction at age 16, is my understanding. You were writing short sci-fi stories, and I think you took a hiatus for a while before you got back to writing in earnest, and eventually it resulted in this novel. But let me ask you, go back to age 16. What motivated you to write at that time? What kind of mental or emotional rewards were you getting from writing at age 16?
That's an interesting question. I'm not really sure where the spark came from. I think I started writing things much long before I was 16. 16 is sort of when I started thinking I wanted to be more serious about it. I got a journal and started writing in a journal and keeping track of what I was writing. But before that, I had been sort of doing comics and writing little stories for my friends. I had been big into role-playing games and liked to be the DM in role-playing games and make up stories, for friends of mine. I had always been a really big reader. And I have a feeling that part of why I became a writer was just wanting to do some of the things that were done in books that I'd read that I loved, and then also just a general, maybe an impulse towards storytelling that I had always had as a kid, like I said, with role-playing games and that kind of thing.
How far back do you think the writing goes? How young were you when you first started messing around with it?
My mother claims that the first story she discovered of mine was written when I was about 8 or 9 years old, and it was just a short piece about some guy who lived in a swamp. It was a very detailed description, according to her, of a snake that he was watching in a tree in a swamp. That sounds about right. I think description is the thing that has always come easiest to me as a writer, and then the rest of it were things I had to learn along the way.
So you mentioned that you were always a big reader. Now, was this something, were your parents such that the TV is off and they filled the home with books? Were you really encouraged to read, or was it something that just you were automatically drawn to it?
No, my mother taught me how to read when I was 3 years old, and then she encouraged me constantly to read as much as she could. And I always really loved it, so it didn't take much encouragement. And I remember one thing she did was, we had a rule, which was I couldn't really get toys and things like that at the store, but I could get books if I wanted them pretty generously. So I had lots of books and got to go to the library a lot and was always encouraged to read. And I always read really widely. Even when I was a little kid, I kind of just plucked whatever it was off the shelf that interested me and read that.
So you got this early start with reading and writing. You did have a hiatus, I believe, and you got back to writing science fiction in, I think it was 2015 when you started writing science fiction. Or do you even consider yourself a sci-fi writer?
I mean, I consider myself a writer, and I think that science fiction or speculative fiction is what I've been writing since about 2015. Actually, I didn't really write any speculative fiction before that. I used to write in the late 90s and early 2000s. I published a series of sort of noir crime and detective stories, including a novella that came out in the UK, and stories in Ellery Queen and things like that. And the first things that I wrote were more kind of mainstream literary short stories. Later branched out into the crime stuff, then got into doing travelogues. I didn't have a huge hiatus in my actual writing, but I had a big hiatus in publishing. And one of the reasons was that I moved overseas. So I joined the Peace Corps in 2003. And when I joined the Peace Corps, most magazines were still only accepting things by mail and with a self-addressed stamped envelope. And I was living in Turkmenistan. So it was virtually impossible to really keep up my habit of submitting, which I'd been doing pretty religiously since I was in high school. And for that reason, and just the, involvement of living overseas, I kind of stopped submitting my work. And then I got back into writing more seriously, like on a more regular schedule, and started being able to submit when tools like Submittable came around and places started taking electronic submissions. So some of it was kind of a hiatus from, let's say, writing regularly, but then some of it was just the way that the industry changed as the internet finally kind of took hold. And the industry, as you know, was really late to adopt the internet. Yes. I mean, I remember that a lot of these magazines were very reluctant to do anything but print submissions for a long time.
What a game changer it was when they started taking email, because, in fact, nowadays you have people who say, we will not accept anything by surface mail. It needs to be email, and it can't be attached, and so on and so forth, unless, of course, they request the transcript, or not transcript, but the manuscript. So you were writing short-form stuff. You were writing short story fiction. Was it a tough decision to decide, I'm not going to write a short story right now, I'm going to do a full-length novel? Was that a bridge almost too far, or was it something you tackled with relish?
I think I had, so before I started writing this novel, I'd written 2 novellas, which were kind of a way to work my way up into a longer form. And I had written the novella when I was younger. I wrote this novella that I published in the UK with TTA Press. I also actually wrote 2 crime novels, which I never tried to get published and which I just sort of put in a suitcase.
Were they practice to you? I mean, did you see them as practice and they were not fully realized?
I didn't see them as practice at the time that I wrote them, and I did send one of them out and got a very positive rejection, I remember, from Forge. But I didn't have the wherewithal to get an agent or publish or anything at that time. I mean, I'm talking about books that I wrote when I was 22 and then 25 or 26 years old. So this was much earlier in my writing career. Now that I look back at them, they're just a completely different person wrote them, and I wouldn't consider them to be complete. Right.
So is there anything about short story writing that you brought to the novel? I mean, for instance, do you break up, any big project, we're always told, whether it's writing or anything at all, we're told break it into pieces. Do you approach writing a full-length novel as a lot of short stories, or is it something completely different than that for you?
I think the idea needs to be much bigger than the idea that you have for a short story. I think what dictated writing a novel for me was just the size of the idea that I was trying to work on. So it wasn't something that I was going to be able to tackle at a novella length. It wasn't something I was going to be able to do at a short story length. I think one of the sort of challenges for me was, if I'm going to write a novel, what I didn't want to do was waste a lot of space. And so I wanted to retain the compactness of a short story, but at like an 80,000 or 90,000 word length. One of the things that I went into was a goal of not padding anything. So like not padding the plot, not, having anything be longer than it needed to be, because I didn't want to just be expanding a short story or a novella into a novel-sized space. I wanted to completely fill the canvas that I had decided to use. So I wanted to just make sure that I was using all my skills as a short story writer, and not just, let's say, just using those skills to write a longer short story, but instead using everything I'd learned as a short story writer to properly fill a much larger form, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. I think there's a lot of published authors out there who have done some fluffing with the books that they write, it's not all compact, as you say. It's not all compression writing. They do tend to stretch out at times. What do you hope to achieve with the finished product? I mean, how would you, whether it be a short story or a novel, what is the goal of the finished product? How would you put that into words?
I would say for me, what a finished story should be is a kind of place in which you can ask complicated questions, a kind of architecture for a better understanding, a space in which you can think about complex things that normally you wouldn't think about in your day-to-day life. And I think this kind of goes for everything, from a poem to a short story to a novel. It's the kind of architecture. And I think that in fiction, the mistake that could be made is trying to present some kind of an answer to something. And I really don't think that works, at least for me, in my fiction. What I'm interested in doing is kind of exploring. So for me, I engage with each new project in a very curious way. I'm interested to find out more about this. I'm interested to ask a lot of increasingly complex questions about it, and the writing is a way for me to do that. So it's a way to guide my curiosity, and it's also a way to kind of bring people into a space where we can talk about things in a way that you wouldn't have been able to talk about if this particular form didn't exist.
Yes. Yeah. I think it's Milan Kundera who said the brilliance of the novel is the questions it raises, not the answers it supplies. Mm-hmm. And I always liked his writing. I thought that was just a great quote that kind of falls somewhat into line with what you're saying. Is there a science fiction author who most influenced you? Or an author? Let's not restrict you to a genre, but maybe science fiction, and then maybe broader than that.
Yeah, I can't. So science fiction authors, I mean, I've liked Philip K. Dick at different times. I really like James Tiptree, Alice Sheldon, right? And Ursula K. Le Guin, others. I mean, I don't have a consistent favorite science fiction author. I'd say if I was looking at authors in general who've been big influences on me, when I was in that really formative phase of learning how to be a writer and trying to learn how to write well, Patricia Highsmith was a huge influence on me. And in general, the mid-century American crime and noir writers like David Goodis and Jim Thompson, people like that. And the reason really was because those writers knew how to do things in small spaces very well. I felt like a lot of the best American kind of crime fiction of that time was almost poetry in the way that they handled their prose. And I'm not talking about the sort of bad pulp stuff, but the stuff that really elevates it to, a higher level. Right. Books like Dorothy D. Hughes's Ride the Pink Horse, or Patricia Highsmith's Strangers on a Train, or The Talented Mr. Ripley. Like, these are real works of art. And I think if you're talking about, formative influences, those are them. I think I was also really lucky as a kid because my mother, besides teaching me to read really early, really invested in a love of Shakespeare and took me to see a lot of his plays and had kind of a method for it where she would read me a sort of children's version of the story or a summary, and we would talk about it, and then we would go to the play and then talk about it afterwards. And I really gained an appreciation for reading difficult things and trying to read closely and trying to really pull from a text a meaning. And I think it's been really rewarding. I mean, I say that one of the themes of The Mountain and the Sea is I read all these books so that you don't have to, right? It's like, being able to process that, very complex information and then hopefully deliver it to people in a way that's entertaining and open and engaged and not as as much of a grind as some of the science is to get through is really a goal of mine.
You mentioned Patricia Highsmith. I recently read her, it was either a biography or autobiography, I forget which, I'd have to go back and look, but one of the things she talked about or was written about her is that she lived alone. Almost her entire life she lived alone. She didn't like to live with anybody because she said when you're a writer, you need lots and lots of space, that quiet time, that space within your own head. Now, you're married and you have a daughter. Can you relate to what she's saying, even though you obviously have other human beings in the household?
I don't think you need to not have people around you to have a space in your own head. I think that I am very good at kind of carrying on a conversation with myself all day long about ideas that I'm sorting through, even while I'm talking to other people, doing other things. It's always processing somewhere in the background. And I think some of it is just, things like awareness of how your mind works. Like when I'm, driving the car and know there's no one else in the car and I'm, by myself, then I'm quite often by myself with the music off, right? Just thinking and finding time to think things through. I mean, a lot of writing, of course, as you know, doesn't occur with the hand putting ink on a page or typing things into a computer. It's just occurring in this kind of back brain. And you're sorting through all these different issues. But I do think that idea of mental space, I guess the more that I think about it, the more I'd say I somewhat disagree. I think that having people around me and being a father and being a husband and being connected to people makes me a better writer. And I think that I became a much better writer after my daughter was born because my concerns for the future became much more urgent to me. And I don't think I would be as good a writer if I didn't have her.
Interesting. So you mentioned conversation with yourself. Is that literally something that is it a running dialogue or monologue, or is it subliminal? Because when you were speaking to that, it sounded almost like it may be something that's going on below the surface, or are you actually hearing it?
No, I think it's sort of it's like a continual sort of information processing is what it feels like. Like I'm thinking about an idea, I'm just sort of exploring some sort of subject in the back of my head, and then sometimes it'll get to the point where I need to write something down. So I use Evernote usually for this. I'll just put something into like my notepad on my phone, and or I also carry a notebook, so it just depends on where I am and what situation I'm in. And then those little fragments I'll consolidate into this document, whether it's the notes for the novel, if it's related to the novel, I tag it all and then consolidate it later into different places. I also have this thing just called a writing sandbox, which is just a document with a date on it. And when I would write short stories, they go at the top, but underneath there is all the titles I've thought of and other story ideas that I have and other little sort of snippets that come from that kind of running. It's more of a processing of things I'm taking in. So I read a book or I see a movie, it bounces off of something else. I get an idea from that. I might write it down or just start sifting through it, trying to figure out how I feel about it. And then later it will come up, in a story, or in a character's conversation in a book or something like that.
So you mentioned movies. Can you give us a few sci-fi movies that you found to be quality stories that are also delivered with high production values that you cherish?
I just watched this movie Vesper, which I thought was really good. Kind of an independent science fiction film made by European production companies about a girl who is trying to kind of re-energize nature in a very sort of post-apocalyptic world by bioengineering a seed that will be able to reproduce more than once. Because the whole world is basically dominated by these citadels that sell people seeds that only can be used one time, which is just ironic since most of our food is grown from seeds that can only be used one time, of course. But yeah, that was a really good one. I think, a lot of those science fiction films are, and again, I watch a lot of movies, and like lately I've been writing a new book, but I'm watching a lot of Japanese noir films from the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Science fiction, I think if I was going to think of a movie that was classically just excellently structured, I think the best example I could think of is Alien, because I think it's just done so well, and it's not that the movie is incredibly, I think it's actually philosophically quite deep, but none of that matters so much to just how skillfully it's executed. And the example I always give is that the first 10 minutes or so of that film occur in virtual silence and just consist of these like long camera pans across equipment and empty corridors in this spaceship before the crew wakes up. And it's just such a brilliant setup, because what it really gives you a sense of as a viewer is this loneliness of deep space. And it puts you into this sort of terrified state before anything happens in the movie. So I think that for me is always a really good lesson in atmosphere. And if I was going to teach a class on how to write atmosphere, I would say, that's what you want to look to do, is create a mood that doesn't even need anything to happen inside it to be what it is.
Right. That what you're describing there is also what I loved about 2001: A Space Odyssey, where there was so much silence and that feeling of isolation, and you could hear the hiss of oxygen being fed into the ship. And a great piece of work,
so true.
As is Alien. I mean, no question about it. And how
so
long
true.
in that movie that you went with before you saw what they were really dealing with?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think, not showing the monster is always the key for as long as possible. And if you can do that for the entire film, then it's even better. I think, another good film, and it's not really a science fiction movie, but a horror film, is It Follows. That was a great movie. Just terrifying, where you really never see what it is. And it's just incredibly sort of hair-raising. I think for me, it's not so much about genre. It's about, is a film or a book done well? Does it do what it is doing on its own terms very well? For example, I mean, I like action films, but only the ones that I think are sort of that do that, do what an action film should do really well. So a perfect example for me would be, if Alien is a perfect example of a horror film, then Aliens, right, is probably one of the better constructed action films around. And Terminator 2 is another great example of like a perfectly timed, perfectly staged action film, right? It's not high art, but it is beautiful and brilliant, and it works just like a clock.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, when you're writing, Ray, do you write for yourself? Who's your audience? Is it first and foremost Ray Nayler, or do you have a specific person in mind? Or what's your how's your targeting work on that? Who are you really writing for?
So I think when I was in my 20s, I was writing for myself. And I had something I wanted to say, and I just wanted to say it. I think that the difference between then and now is right now I really have a clearer idea of the relationship between a writer and a reader. And I'm not writing for any particular person, but I'm writing for the receptive reader who it brings something of their own to the text, but also brings an open mind. And I'm writing in order to be understood. And I think that's very different from just speaking, or writing to say something. It's not about saying something, it's about being understood. And I'm really kind of focused on that aspect of writing. It seems kind of esoteric, but I would say it's like the difference between what you say being the final kind of arbiter of a speech act and what someone understands you to have said being the final speech act, if that makes sense. Like what appears in the brain of the person who is reading. And I'm much more aware of that and trying to control my prose to give space for them to connect to the text and also sort of create those reactions rather than just saying what I want to say. Interesting.
Now, I heard you say, I heard you on YouTube say that you have to be really deeply interested in something to write about it. And we're just about to talk about your novel, and I wanted you to give a description of it. But before we do that, talk about what you're deeply interested in. What kind of subject matter deeply interests you?
Well, I'm deeply interested in as you can tell when I was just talking about, I'm deeply interested in the communicative acts, right? Like what we are doing when we're talking to one another, what we are doing as a society when we're communicating. I'm really interested in semiotics, which is a subject that I was interested in ever since university. And I'm particularly interested in animal communications and in how we communicate with other species. And I mean this in a really kind of day-to-day way. Like, how do you talk to your dog, right? How do you understand the needs of, any domestic animal or other non-human being that you're in contact with? So I'm interested in how we bridge gaps in communication. I'm also interested in the future of this planet and in trying to figure out where some of our technologies are taking us, not in the sense of, like, I'm not particularly interested in new technologies and trying to predict them, but I'm really interested in societal forms and what technology does to them, and trying to think about some of those both negative and positive results that some technology might have on us as a species.
Like social media.
Like social media, yes.
Is social media net negative or a net positive for society? There's obviously good and bad in it, but where does it sit on the, if you were to, on balance?
Yeah.
Is it positive? Is it negative? Or do you feel like it's a wash?
On balance, it's hard for me to say, and I think that my approach to it is a little bit different. I get more out of social media maybe than a lot of people do, because I've traveled to and lived in so many different countries, and I have a lot of people in those countries that I wouldn't have any contact with if it weren't for Facebook, for example. Mm-hmm. So I would just be completely cut off from them if it wasn't for social media. And so I really value it for that reason. I do think that it has this really negative way of of manipulating people into turning their lives into data. And that is, into turning everything into a proof of action or a proof of something to be shown to the world rather than just doing things in the world. And I think that's really problematic. I see a lot of writers, and I worry sometimes about them, counting words and then putting those word counts up on social media, right? Things like that. I worry about it because we're not just productivity machines, right? We're not supposed to be countable and measurable in this way. And I think that is a really unhealthy aspect of social media. I mean, I think another unhealthy aspect of social media just comes from the way human brains work. We, my sort of judge of, is something suitable to be said is, would you say it in the presence of the person that you are writing to on social media? So if you were in a room with them having a discussion about something, is this how you would have it? Or are you doing something that you would only do because you're detached from that immediacy?
That's
right?
a good barometer right there.
And so I'm trying, and I'm completely imperfect at this, but I'm trying very hard, and I have been doing this for a while, to only engage with people on social media in the way I would engage with them if they were within an arm's distance of me.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, I think it was Bill Bryson who wrote in one of his books that when you look at life, all the different life forms, there is a real, how did he put it? Basically, there's a lack of ambition. They're content simply to exist, just to be who they are. Human beings are very different, though. We strive to improve, self-improvement, human potential. We set goals. We want to write books. We want to achieve large bank accounts and so on. But most life doesn't operate that way. Mostly life simply being, the very act of being is what it's about. It's more Zen-like and spiritual, really, than human beings tend to operate.
That's an interesting take. I would put it a little bit differently. I think that life fundamentally is about striving for all living creatures, but what they're striving for is very different. And mostly what a bird. I'm sitting here watching my bird feeder on our balcony be slowly emptied by, sparrows and starlings, right? Well, mostly what they're striving for is to sustain their life in that moment. Different for our domestic animals that are well taken care of, but if you look out in the wild, I think that life kind of consists of actually this impulse toward maintaining itself alive, breeding, eating, moving in such a way through the world that it gets what it needs. But those needs are somewhat simple. They're very direct. And while they're targeted, their targets are usually pretty close. So, the lion is interested in its next meal. The antelope, likewise is interested in moving with the herd, going to a place with a slightly better pasture, etc. So they are future oriented, just like humans are. I don't draw sort of a line between us and them. I think we're all very future oriented. And in fact, future orientation is what defines life. So I think that, so before life exists, all mechanical processes, right, all of physics, the difference between physics and life is that physics is not affected by anything in the future, right? It just does what it does according to where it's been pushed by the past, by what's already occurred, and that pushes it toward, you roll a rock downhill, it's not being pulled down the hill, right? But a human rolls a rock down a hill to kill something at the bottom of it. Right? And so it rolls the rock down the hill with a goal, but then like a cheetah aims slightly ahead of its prey because it's also future oriented, right? And it's running for a reason. It's not running because it's been propelled by a force. It's running to do a thing, and that thing is to catch something. So I think all life is striving and is future oriented, but the difference with humans is that we're incredibly complex in our outlook, and we're able to look very, very far into the future, much further than other animals are able to look. And we can do that because of the way that we communicate in our language and the way our language is structured. We're also able to look really far into our own pasts in ways that are very sophisticated, and I think for the same reason, because our brains are very large and very sophisticated, compared to most other animals on this planet. But yeah, I think then so it's essentially like Bill Bryson and I are in a way kind of saying the same thing. So most animals are basically content with just getting the next thing that is on their agenda to get, whether it's food or sleep or whatever. We're not content with that. We have to have some goals that are much more long-term, and we're able to have those long-term goals because we have culture and language and all of these other things. We're also the only animals that live inside ideologies that we build, right?
Right. Right.
We live inside these, we build castles in the air out of things like nationalism and senses of ethnic solidarity and all kinds of negative things like racism and that sort of thing. And then we live in those castles that we built out of these fictions, and they actually affect our actions, and we will kill each other over these ideologies and fictions that we've produced completely out of our sophisticated brains. So it's fascinating.
Yeah.
You get a lot of high art, but you also get a lot of trash from those sophisticated brains.
Yeah, all these mental constructs that we create that are destructive in many cases. And the paranoia and the fear of people of other cultures, other countries, and so on plays out badly so often. Really interesting stuff, Ray. Let's talk about your novel now, The Mountain in the Sea, which has been really well received. Talk about, give our listeners the overview of the novel.
Yeah, so The Mountain in the Sea has three storylines. The main storyline is about a scientist, a marine biologist, and a specialist in cephalopod communication, Dr. Hong Nguyen, who is called to a set of islands off the coast of Vietnam to investigate what may be a sapient octopus that appears to have linguistic and other cultural capabilities that we haven't seen in another species before. And I'm specifically not using the word sentient because I think that much of life is quite sentient. But this is an octopus that might have a human or human-like level of culture. And she's there with an android, possibly the world's first and last, who is struggling with identity and their own ideas of self and isolation, and who's been put on those islands because they're not accepted by humanity. And then also a security sort of guard who is using drones to protect the island. The islands have been evacuated of their population, and these three are alone there studying this octopus species. And then two other storylines, and it doesn't become clear until toward the end of the book why they all sort of fit together or how kind of also inform this world. It's a near future. It's kind of marketed as a thriller. I don't know if that's the right word for it or not, but it's very much about trying to solve the hard problem of if there were another species and we really had first contact with a species that was like us in being able to communicate in the ways that we communicate, would we really be able to talk to them? So that, I think, is the core concept.
Now, when you say android, so this is a human-like robot that's at the archipelago?
Yes.
I see.
Yeah,
okay.
That's been built by an international tech corporation, and then has been not accepted and actually rendered illegal by most of the countries in the world. So
how long did it take you to write the book? Once you settled on the concept and kind of figured out what you wanted to write, how long did the outlining and writing take?
So it took me about 18 months from beginning to when I submitted it to when I submitted it to agents, and then I did some rewrites after I got comments back from my agent, etc. But from beginning, those rewrites were not hugely significant, and so I would say about 18 months. I think I had, before I opened the document to begin the novel, had done a lot of the thinking and reading that formed the initial idea. So let's say about 2 years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, here's a species which we didn't know existed in this form. I mean, we know there's octopus, octopi, or what have you. But you may have read some Edward O. Wilson, who said that the number of known species of plants, animals, microorganisms on the planet that we've codified is like about 1.9 million, but he says that the actual number is likely well beyond 5 million, and we haven't even discovered these things yet. So,
Sure.
And I bring that up because your novel really it made me think of Edward O. Wilson in his thoughts on that, and how little we really know about the place we're living. There's just much more going on here than we're aware of. And you mentioned physics earlier. Physics is the same thing, where we start to realize there are things going on that we are not perceiving, that our
Right.
senses are not equipped to pull in and give us the kind of enlightened sort of perspective, unless you drop either, I don't know what, you either die or you drop acid or do something that kind of opens things up a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it's not denigrating science to say that there's a lot of things that science doesn't understand yet. We have this extremely powerful tool in science that we've been using to look beyond where our senses take us. And it's a really interesting journey, but it's certainly far from over. I mean, we don't know. There's a lot of things we don't know about how our own ecosystems work. There's certainly a lot of things about the ocean which remain to be discovered. I mean, most of it is unexplored, especially most of the deep parts of the ocean. And we're continually finding new things. But not only that, we're continually finding new things out about things we already knew about. I mean, I think that the recent discoveries of fungal networks in forests are amazing, right? The way that trees communicate with each other, warn each other about predators, right? Feed and support one another via these fungal networks connected to their roots, do all sorts of things that seem very conscious and very intricate and very much like a society, and that's something that we knew nothing about, say, 20 years ago. So science is taking us into some really interesting places. I think that, unfortunately, I think science is somewhat beleaguered right now by misunderstandings of what it is. But it's slowly peeling back layer upon layer of mystery. And I think it's an amazing thing to be alive right now when the amount of change in a human lifetime has just increased dramatically. And it's not just about technology, but just the things that we know about the universe, the conceptual changes. When we're living right now in a time where some of the people, who are alive today, when they were kids growing up, thought that the cosmos consisted just of the Milky Way, right? Didn't know that there were other galaxies out there, or just how vast space really was. I'm talking about the very oldest people alive on the planet, right? And things like the Big Bang are relatively recent discoveries. So we keep not only uncovering new things, but also uncovering these vast areas for exploration. These huge gaps in our knowledge, these gigantic restructurings of how we look at the world. And you made a good point about physics, right? This is the way that physics operates on one level in this pretty comprehensible way, and then underneath that there's just this bizarro world that has all sorts of things in it that we just fundamentally don't understand, and that completely turn upside down our picture of the universe, right? I mean, just the concept of quantum entanglement is so bizarre that you really can't think about it for too long without getting a little bit freaked out. Right. About just what is going on in the universe, right?
Yeah, you mentioned that physics is kind of, in a way, it's passive. It does what it does, but it also is reactive because they've found that just by observing something, you change it.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is amazing.
It's completely amazing.
Yeah. You know, what's interesting about the mountain and the sea, among other things, is that, you know, the species in question is right here on planet Earth rather than from a different solar system. We didn't have to travel somewhere to find this species, or it didn't come from outer space to Earth to represent a threat or a helping hand or whatever, that it was right here under our noses, but we were oblivious to this particular, what would you call it, species of a particular octopus. Now is this is it an individual octopus, or is it really a species of octopus?
It's a species of octopus, and the reason for that is there's no individual who could have culture or the ability to communicate. That always has to exist at some kind of a communal level, a species level or a multi-species level. So those communications, that kind of sophisticated symbolic level culture, a language that can be, written, that can hold concepts about the past and the future and things like that, that only occurs when you have enough like-minded individuals to create it. So it's about an octopus species that's been able to achieve that. And yeah, I have to say that one of the reasons I wrote the book was to set this challenge in front of me of what would it really be like to communicate with a quote alien unquote species. And I didn't want to pick just some species that I invented wholesale, because I really wanted to investigate the hard problem and really understand the why and the how and the details of this. It's very easy if you invent some alien species that can do whatever it wants and be constructed however it wants, to figure out how you would communicate it with it. But if you take something like the octopus, which actually exists, and then try to figure out how it might evolve into an octopus that could pass information from generation to generation, communicate, have a society, those kinds of things, then it's a much more difficult problem. And I'm really interested as a writer in solving the difficult problems.
Right. So are you working on a new book now? And if so, what can you tell us about it?
Yeah, I am working on a new book now, and right as we speak, I'd say I'm halfway through the first draft. It's always hard to say. I'd say I'm about halfway through a first draft, so halfway through being happy with something. My first drafts are not real first drafts, in the sense that I'm not one of these writers that just puts whatever it is on paper and goes and fixes it later. I usually, by the time a first draft is complete, most of the chapters have been rewritten 30 or 40 times. So, I very carefully go forward, build a little bit, go back, restructure, go forward, go back. And I have this kind of iterative drafting process that's very different from most of the writers that I know. But I'm about halfway through that in this book, and it is much more about, I don't want to say too much about it, because some of the magic goes away if you talk about it too much. But let's just say it's about governance systems.
Okay.
Yeah. More than, it's not a first contact story. It's much more of a political, a story of political intrigue.
So would it be, what genre would it fall into, or is this not a genre book? Is it a piece of literature?
No, it's still very much speculative fiction. So it's still another piece of near future speculative fiction. But if you think about it, so if you took the mountain and the sea, it would be more about the world that is in the background of the mountain and the sea. It's not that world, but more about that level of like political structures and human freedoms and that kind of thing.
So what would you say, Ray, are the marks of distinction in your writing that when somebody, actually, maybe I should back up and just ask you, as when somebody reads your next novel, who's already read your first novel, do you want them to say, I know this voice, this is Ray Nayler? Or do you strive to create a new work that has a completely different voice, that takes people a place they haven't been before and is not familiar to the first novel that they've read from you?
I think it goes back to that. You were saying, in another interview, I talked about having to be really deeply interested in something in order to be able to write it. And people have asked me if I would do a sequel, for example, to The Mountain and the Sea, because there's a lot more to do in that world and with the idea. And I've said, like, I would do one if it could capture as much interest as was necessary from me to do it. But in order for a sequel to be able to do that, it would have to be completely vitally necessary. And I just don't know if that's something that's gonna happen. So I think for me, it's not so much about, do I want to modulate my voice or not as a writer. It's I have to. I can't write the same thing over and over again. I couldn't just churn out something that was boring to me, because I would just give up on it. I'm too impatient. I'm too self-critical, I think, to do that, and I'm just too curious. I've said in other interviews, and it's worth repeating, that I'm kind of like, in a way, like an anti-fan, right? Like, if a fan is a person who likes to have more of the same things and go back to things that they've enjoyed over and over again, and is the kind of person who supports like a franchise and sequels and that kind of thing. I'm the kind of person who, watches a film quite often one time and then never returns to it, even though I really loved it, because I'm looking for the next thing that I'll really love, right, in a different way. And so I think as a writer, I'm always going to be trying to advance my own knowledge and my own writing, and then take my reader along on that journey with me. But I think there's always going to be something that's kind of consistent there too.
So when you're in writing mode, when you're going full throttle, you're in the middle of a book like you are right now, what is your writing regimen? When do you write? How long do you write? How many days a week? Can you give us a kind of a sketch? Yeah,
I generally write Monday through Friday, starting somewhere between 5 and 6 a.m. for about 1.5 to 2 hours in the morning. And if I get really involved, or it starts getting toward the end of, say, like a chapter, something like that, I might return to the writing sometime in the evening. But I also have, of course, a full-time job and a lot of other things, and parenting and driving my daughter to daycare and all of that stuff to do. So right now my writing routine is I get up as early as I can stand it, and I sit down on the couch in our small apartment here, and I open up my computer, and I write. And then my daughter usually gets up earlier than she should, and I change her, and then she comes and sits on the couch and hangs out with me and kind of plays quietly while I continue to write for a little while. This is the routine we've sort of built up. And then at some point, it's 7:30 and it's time for us to get ready for our day. And so, I go and wake up my wife and get the day started. But yeah, right now the routine has been that for about the first hour I'm writing alone, and for about the last half an hour or so, just depending on when she wakes up, I'm writing with this little 3-year-old kid hanging out with me on the couch. And she's been very good about allowing me to continue to write, since that's the price to pay for her to be there. Yeah.
So final question. And I'm not sure if this is even a fair question, but how do you expect your writing to change as you age?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I feel like right now I've been really there's a lot there in that question. My hope is that I will be able to maintain my level of curiosity about the world and my level of interest without boxing myself in to anything that would decrease that curiosity or creativity. I have a feeling, and it's just maybe an intuition, that people's intellectual and creative decline often comes from a decreasing lack of interest in the new. And in continuing to explore the world, they get kind of hamstrung by habit. And they start to do the same things over and over again because those things are easy. So my hope would be that as an older writer, I continue to do new things and stay interested. And if I can do that, I think I can continue to produce really interesting work for other people. But it gets harder. I think you have, the habit is like this incrustation that builds up on you, and you have to continually break it off and shed that and try to stay flexible and move forward and get away from it. Otherwise, you become kind of frozen in place. And I fear that. I really do. I see it happen with a lot of writers, but then I also see writers who manage to escape it.
Yeah. It's definitely it's a threat. It is something that we need to be on guard against. I just, I'm at an age now where I see a lot of, friends of mine who have stopped being interested in learning. They are in just kind of that mode where I've learned a lot of things in my life. I don't want to learn anything else, whether it's a simple app or whatever, a music streaming service, you name it.
Right.
It's kind of wild.
It sort of applies to everything if it applies to one thing, right? Like people who are disinterested in the world are disinterested in the world. They're disinterested in apps and in new music and in the opinions of young people and everything else. Yeah.
There's this withdrawal that takes place, which I fear. That's not something. That's not a place I want to be. Is withdrawing from society in kind of a shrinking footprint. And I see it not only intellectually, but I see it physically, that people, they won't travel anymore. Right. They won't travel as far, and so on and so forth. So, Ray Nayler, this has been a fascinating discussion. You do a lot of really interesting thinking. Thank you for coming on the program and sharing your thoughts.
Thank you too, Mike. I really enjoyed this. It was very, very fun to go over some of this stuff with you, and I really appreciate you again inviting me to do this.